So Chapter 13, Key Issue 2, is about where people are distributed within urban areas. So we're going to look at some of the major models that are applied to the U.S., the concentric zone, the sector, and the multiple nuclei models. Although these can be a bit dated, they certainly have modern day applications still. We're also going to look at how the three models can help explain where people live today. We'll look at how these three urban models explain patterns in European cities and what problems they have. And then we'll look at urban models in developing countries, and then we'll look at the history of the development of cities in developing countries. So to look at where people are distributed within urban areas, we'll look at the first major model. It's called the concentric zone model, or the Burgess model. It was created in 1923 by a sociologist. He was looking at Chicago. In fact, the first couple models we look at were all developed in Chicago, just at different times. This model explained the distribution of different social groups within an urban area. This model suggests that the city grows outward from a central area in a series of concentric rings. So in the center of the city, you'll have the center business district, and that's where most of your non-residential activities will occur. And then you have a zone of transition, a zone of working class homes, a zone of better residents, and the commuter zone. And I'm going to kind of explain them to you while we're looking at it. So in this idea of a city, the newest part of the city will be on the outside. So the city is going to be growing out from its heart, the oldest part, and expanding outwards. Now, obviously, just like when we talked about our other circle model this year, von Thunen, you're not going to have it always be perfectly round, because you could have a lake here, like in Chicago, there's Lake Michigan, a river going through it, a mountain. But the idea is the oldest parts of the city will be within, and the newest parts will be on the outside. When this model was created in the 1920s, we were in a period of rapid industrialization. And so the center of Chicago was mostly a business district. The second zone here would have been a zone of transition, and that meant it would have had the people they were bringing in to work in different factory jobs. So it would have been low-income housing, small homes, and they would have been some of the really like the oldest houses. So they would have been like large houses, maybe were divided into tenement homes or subdivided. And then outside you would have had newer buildings, right? These are homes for working class individuals. And they would have been modest homes. They were still older, but they certainly weren't people living in high poverty. And then out here you would have the zone of better residents. So this is people who live in nicer homes, newer homes, more spacious. You see how there's yards here in this model? So they're not jam-packed. These are mostly apartments and townhomes. Here people have more trees. And then out here you have the commuter zones, or the suburbs, which kind of kept going outward. This zone really reflects on the price of the land. So the price of the land would have been really expensive here. It also requires that the people couldn't really afford to live in the center business zone, and that people here were working in like factories, and so they couldn't afford to live in newer homes. This land, though, these homes property, even though the land itself is cheaper, people have more land for their homes. So the land here is more expensive, but you've got tons of people cramped in apartment buildings or homes subdivided, and they're living next to like factory areas. Out here, the land might cost less, per square meter, per acre, but you have big, huge homes and giant yards and lots of parks. So this ends up costing perhaps more than one little apartment here. You just get kind of more luxury. When we look at the sector model, or the Hoyt model, this was also developed in Chicago but it was in 1939, so it was about 18 years later, 15 years later, and it was a model that looks at a city that develops in a series of sectors, not perfect rings. And so when Hoyt looked at it, he really looked at like Michigan Avenue, like the wealthy residential area of Chicago. And he said that activities were going to expand outward in a wedge from the center. But you would have wealthy people still living within a city, which is definitely true. And so he was able to look at the expansion of Chicago in a different way. And most people consider this like a refinement or a revision of the original model. That really kind of took into consideration the idea that the concentric zone model really ignores like the high expensive, wealthy residential area. So here you're looking at the central business district of, again, downtown Chicago originally, but you can apply it to other cities. And then you have a little wedge here of the high-class residential area, which would be in Chicago, people who lived along Lake Michigan, people who lived along Lakeshore Drive, people who lived in like the most expensive part of the suburbs. Surrounding that area, you would have middle-class residential areas and also spreading out here. This section here, number 2, this would be transportation and industry. So you would have like railroad tracks here going by all the factories. So here's your railroad tracks picking up your materials. You'd also have a highway going along the outside of it. This would transport people easily in and out of the city, transport materials and goods primarily in and out of the city. And then surrounding this area, you're going to have less expensive homes. And this model worked a little better. So if you were really wealthy, you weren't going to live anywhere near these factories. And even if you look at the middle class homes surrounding this commercial sector, you're still going to see apartments and townhouses before you get to single family homes. So then in 1945, geographers Harris and Ullman created what's called the multiple nuclei model. And in this model, they looked at the idea that the city was more complex than the first 2 models looked at, and that there was more than one center. And so that the center business district isn't always the only place that can draw people into a city. And so the multiple nuclei model looks at the idea that places are kind of divided up by whatever's pulling you to live in the city. So right here you have the central business district. And near the central business district, you're going to have light manufacturing today. So by this time in 1945, most people weren't doing heavy manufacturing right in the heart of the city because now land is way too expensive. And so light manufacturing, maybe some wholesale warehouses, which makes sense because it's near the center business district, near lots of business offices, and near easy access to transportation. But this isn't the only pool you have. And so out here you've got your heavy manufacturing. And so in your heavy manufacturing, you've got next to that, you have people who can't afford, you've got like the lower income homes. So lower income homes are going to be outside of the light manufacturing and outside of this heavy industrial manufacturing. And then you might have out here a high-class residential area, so way out here, far away. Again, bigger yards, more expensive property. And then here you've got like the regular suburbs, not super expensive homes, but people are willing to drive in, so middle-class families. Here you have your middle-class residential areas here. And then you also have the industrial suburb area here and here. And so these are kinds of light industry or light businesses that are drawing people in because people started to locate their offices or their manufacturing hubs outside of the center business district. Additionally, you're going to find things like, so here's your outlying business district, here's your outlying industry center. You're also going to find that people who live near a university might have certain pools to that area. So if you have a university in an area, you're probably going to have more like used bookstores, more coffee shops, a lot of times even different types of food. Whenever I went out to eat with my professors, they always like to eat like a wide range of different foods from different countries. If you were looking near like an airport in the city, you're going to find different patterns. So people spending huge amounts of money on homes aren't going to locate their home outside of a large airport. So outside of an airport, you're going to find it more like manufacturing or low-income housing. Outside of the center business district, you might also have some apartment buildings where people who work late hours young single professionals might live. And so the idea that there are multiple centers that draw different people in. The models help us understand where people with different social characteristics tend to live and why. And these models are really simple. Just like we talked about with the other models we talked about. They don't look at the different landscape of the area. They don't always apply all the site or situation factors. They're just a broad way to understand the world. They're older, they're dated. They don't always explain modern day patterns or in other countries, but we can use them to understand this change of a city. Just keep in mind that you don't want to oversimplify things too much, that these models were a simplified general way to understand the development of an urban area within the U.S. And then we can expand upon that with new information, and we can talk about how it's changed historically. Combining the models can help explain where different people live in the city and why. And they overall suggest that people prefer to live near others who have similar characteristics. So, for example, if we look at Houston, in the concentric zone model, you're going to see that the newer housing is built up outside of downtown Houston. So in 2005, when this was taken, or this map was made, the older homes were mostly in the center and most of the new housing was on the outside. So that fits with the concentric zone model, that newer homes and more expensive homes are on the outside of the city. In Houston, you can see almost like slices, right? You can see the middle income homes. You can see a small little sector with high income homes, and then you can see the sector with the low income homes, just like the sector model. And in this map here, where it shows different ethnicities within Houston, you can see the idea of multiple nuclei. And so there are people who are living closer to their own ethnic groups, and what's pulling them to that area is different. So it might be a different school or where their families already lived, but there were many different reasons to live clustered together in the city. In Europe, the models don't really work well. In many old European cities, the wealthy live in the inner portions of the city, not just in the suburbs. And most of the newer built housing in the suburbs is high-rise apartment for low-income people and recent immigrants, and that's different than in the U.S. So when you're in Paris, the most expensive property is right here. And as you get out further away, it becomes kind of cheaper. It becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And so what would be like a ghetto in Paris would be on the outskirts of the city. In developing countries, the poor are accommodated in many suburbs, and the wealthy also tend to live near the center of the city. So there's a sector that comes out. So here's where the wealthiest live. Here's a central market area, which is common in Latin American cities. And in the outside, you have your squatter settlements, essentially. Within developing countries, you would have had people, most people lived in rural settlements before the European established colonies, and really immediately after too, right? So, but there were a few principal cities in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So, for example, the Aztecs had major city centers before it was colonized. Existing cities in Latin America, Asia, and Africa were expanded to provide colonial services once the Europeans took over. And you can kind of see the development of what is later Mexico City. And that's about it.